I'm Peter Suskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. Today, our guest is Da Wei, director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. I think we've had 23 episodes so far. You're our second-time guest. So thanks so much for making another appearance on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me for the second time.
So let's begin by talking about tariffs. That's the obvious hot topic at the moment. So during Trump's first term, he imposed tariffs on China. Biden kept most of them, and then Trump spent the entirety of his presidential campaign promising yet higher tariffs on China. So Beijing obviously had many years to prepare and expected something of the sort, but did China realize that it would get this bad this quickly?
Sometimes I also ask my colleague this question. Are we facing something that we were not expected? We were not prepared? I don't think so, to be honest. Actually, I think President Trump has been consistent on the tariff issue. And on the campaign trail, he, of course, talked a lot about the tariff. And I think after the inauguration, very soon, we know that the Trump administration is going to, they are assessing the tariff issue and they are going to announce something in early April. And it will be a pretty high tariff on a lot of countries, including China. So I think all these messages were heard in Beijing, and I won't say it's a big surprise. Having said that, when you see the so high tariff and also targeted at so many countries, you will still feel kind of shocked. It's a very big event, big development in today's world politics, not only between China and the United States. If it's being implemented, I would say it's a kind of complete change of the international economic and also possibly maybe political relationship among all the countries. So that's something big. When you see something big happening, of course, you will feel a little bit surprised, even though you heard of that. And I think China has been prepared for that for a while, but it's still a big event, big shock.
Well, so Trump began with tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which he rescinded, then reapplied. And then on Liberation Day, he hit essentially every country and island in the world with reciprocal tariffs. But then he paused most of them with the idea that he would negotiate deals over the next 90 days with most of those countries. But he kept them and raised them on China. Do you think that he is also in search of a deal ultimately with China to rebalance trade, but it's just the most complicated relationship, so therefore the approach is a little bit different? Or is he really intent on a total decoupling, in which case no deal would be on the table?
On the one hand, I think President Trump and Trump administration, they will seek a deal with China. I think maybe if we are fortunate enough, we can, when we say we, I mean both China, US, and maybe the whole world. If we are fortunate enough, I think the two sides may maybe scale down the scale of the tariff to some extent. For instance, currently we have a tariff on the US. China have a tariff on US at the level about 125%. The US is even higher. I won't be very surprised if we can scale off to, let's say, the level of 50% or 40%. I think that's something possible, but I don't think it will return to the day like before April the 2nd, back to the level of about 20% or even lower. I don't think that's likely. And on the other hand, the US is negotiating with many countries now, but I personally don't think it's very likely that the Trump administration will remove all the tariff on those countries he announced on April 2nd. The reason is I don't think the goal of the Trump administration is to decouple with particular country like China. I think the Trump administration wants to fundamentally adjust the U.S. economic relations with the rest of the world. I think this is based in the mega thought, like a high tariff with the rest of the world is only part of that. I mean, rebuild the manufacturing sector and also attract other countries and companies invest in the United States. I think they have a set of goals in that regard. So unless they feel the domestic economic situation in the United States is not affordable, I think they will continue to pursue that goal. So China will be a target, but China won't be the only target.
So there's clearly an overarching goal to reduce the American deficit and to reindustrialize, at least in certain sectors, both for security reasons and for economic reasons, and as part of a general MAGA political approach, as you say, that is supposed to favor blue collar workers or make up for the pain that they suffered during globalization. But it's unclear to me in Washington whether China is just bigger by degree or treated as a qualitatively different case. Because to the extent that we are going to now have 10% or whatever permanent tariffs against the entire world, that is part of an attempt to reindustrialize and to reduce the deficit. But there is also talk of China as the big economic and technological competitor, the geopolitical adversary going forward. So that then dictates a different relationship where a more severe decoupling might be necessary. And I can't exactly tell what approach the Trump team is taking. Again, whether it's total decoupling over time or decoupling in certain sensitive spheres, but otherwise an attempt to make a deal that would allow trade to rebalance. So you are one of China's preeminent experts on the US. What sources do you look at? How do you try to determine what the Trump administration's objective actually is and then tailor a response accordingly?
This is a very difficult question to answer or to tell. I mean, which goal is true for the Trump administration and for President Trump. Of course, I think my colleagues also follows all the public information that we can have from the presidential speeches, his social truth accounts, and of course the government documents, and also including, of course, reading the mainstream media and also talking to my friends when I was in the United States or when my American colleagues visited China. The challenge here is there are so many information on the social media, no matter which platform, and many of them are, first, they are just opinions. Secondly, some of the information are not accurate, I will say, or maybe there could be some kind of information warfare there. So a lot of manipulation in the social media, information manipulation. So I'm a little bit worried that in this time of social media, the quality of the information we rely on, we read every day, probably won't be very accurate. So this is a challenge of the time. I think the Chinese analysts are also facing the similar problem. So that increased the difficulty that we are facing to tell the real intention of the US side.
Do you think the US side has a clear intention, an overarching plan? So they launched these reciprocal tariffs, then paused many of them, increased them on China. And Besant, I think that very day, said that we laid a trap for China. China walked into the trap. But now it seems like they're walking back from this statement and hinting at the fact that they're ready to do a deal. So do you believe that these are steps in a plan that was devised earlier, or that they are reacting to circumstances?
Of course, I don't believe that's a well-planned trap. Then the Trump administration waiting for China to be a victim. I don't think so. I tend to view all this as some chaotic situation in Trump administration and also in its process of making the policy. I will say the U.S. politics is always kind of chaotic, and it's particularly so for this administration, I think. Of course, maybe better than the first term. But I mean, I think the President Trump is kind of dominating this administration. He is the one who make the policy. And we all know that President Trump changed his mind very quickly. So again, I don't think it's well designed. I think it's sometimes changing the mind, sometimes the reaction to the situation they see. For example, after China retaliate, the very first 34% of the tariff, the US side made its retaliation. So I don't think it's designed. And I think the negotiation decision to postpone the tariff of many other countries for 90 days, I think it's kind of response to what is happening in the bond market. I think that's also not something designed. But of course, this is my personal view. I think you are correct that there are two views in this administration. I'm still waiting for, wait and see which viewpoints will become kind of dominating in, let's say, 1 year later. One is just, let's say, targeting at China, viewing it as an adversary and competitor, try to weaken China, isolate China. I think this is one school of thought. The other is changing the relationship with the rest of the world, and China is just the biggest country in that world, but it's not targeting at China only. So I think President Trump himself belonged to the second school, but I don't know if that will be still true. Let's say after the several rounds of the action-reaction between the two countries, I don't know if that will change his mind. And also, I don't know if that will be true, let's say, by the end of this year or maybe after the midterm election. He could change. But personally, I think so far, I think President Trump still want to changing the relations with the rest of the world, not targeting China only, and he is still controlling the policy. I think this is my interpretation. But of course, in China, many people have different ideas. I won't say I'm a majority, but there are different views. Yes.
Well, I think that in Washington, in the broader Trump coalition, both objectives are present. Orrin Cass, who is not part of the administration, but seems to be an influential voice outside of it, just wrote an essay the other day in which he suggested sort of a phased decoupling from China, that with the rest of the world, trade needs to be rebalanced, but with China, decoupling, total decoupling, is the ultimate goal. There are others who seem to want a deal, a rebalancing with China as opposed to a decoupling. So if those are the two possibilities, is there anything that China can do to shape the course of events? Because you were talking about the midterm, about other domestic occurrences that might change Trump's mind one way or another. But if China prefers presumably a deal to decoupling, then is there anything that China can do to try to influence Washington along that course?
I think first and foremost, the level of the tariff of the United States is an internal affair of the United States. Changing that level of tariff is a sovereign decision of the United States government. So you can hardly do anything to stop them, right? No matter you like it or not. This is the Trump administration's decision. If Trump administration believe this is a key step to make America great again, how can we persuade the Trump administration and say, okay, can you abandon your primary goal of these 4 years? I don't think we can do that. But at the same time, what China has done so far after April 2nd is if you want to have a trade war, let's have it. And then to show the consequence to the Trump administration, maybe help the Trump administration to understand how serious consequence we could have if we go along this direction. I think this is what China is doing. China, I think, of course, we hope that the Trump administration can realize it could be a lose-lose situation. And at the same time, I think China also can, of course, when time is proper, be flexible enough to step into a kind of negotiation. This morning, I just read the announcement of the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, basically say the Trump administration has expressed their willingness to talk to China for several times, and they also reached out to Chinese government. So we are assessing the situation, and I think this announcement is kind of prelude to some kind of talks and negotiations between China and the US on tariff issue. So of course, I think this is Chinese side's announcement. The US side may have different stories, but I mean, I think all this shows that both sides still want to show flexibility and stepping into a negotiation. So no matter who made the first step, I don't think that's very important. More important thing is both sides, I think, have a chance to negotiate maybe soon and to cool down the temperature. But again, my expectation to that negotiation is not very high. I think we need to be realistic. A tariff of 125, 145% is meaningless, right? But for me, even if a 45% tariff is still too high for a meaningful trade between the two countries. But having a good start to talk, I don't know what kind of content they will reach. Tariff is maybe one thing, and other issues, something like what we have done in the first term, the phase one agreement, that kind of thing, I think is something at least on the table that we can talk to each other.
But some incremental steps. China agrees to purchase American soybeans and airplane parts, maybe some high tech. Is there any chance of large scale Chinese investment in the US?
To be honest, I don't think purchase is something as important as in the year 2020 phase one agreement. So at that time, the balance of the trade is something I think for Trump administration, they want to balance the trade. So you can continue export your products to the US so long as you purchase, let's say, 100 billion a year, then it's okay. But I think that kind of balance of the trade is not, I don't think it's a real balance. I think you said that in Trump administration, many people want to rebalancing economic relations, maybe with China, maybe with the world, but it's a comprehensive rebalancing, not just purchasing something, right? I can purchase something this year or maybe for next 3 years. Can I purchase the US products for next 100 years or 50 years? I don't think we can do that. So we probably need something more. We can say a real rebalancing. And investment, of course, a lot of Chinese companies want to invest in the United States. And before the inauguration and even before the April 2nd, I will say, a lot of experts in China and in the US talking about the future possibility of more greenfield investment in the United States from Chinese company. But to be honest, I think what had happened in past 1 month, I will say, really destroyed people's confidence of investing in the United States. Yes, maybe one day the two governments say, yeah, we can reach a deal and the US will welcome Chinese companies' investment. If I were a senior executive of a Chinese company, I won't do that. I think that's too risky. So what if one day the Trump administration or whatever administration changes policy to China, targeting my operation in the United States? Or if watch what is happening with TikTok and some other Chinese company, they may say, oh, maybe one day when I make profit in the United States, I will be targeted. So I think what has happened after the April 2nd really hurt, damaged the confidence of many Chinese companies, maybe not limited to Chinese companies, but I talked to a lot of Chinese companies here in China. I think I will say damaged their confidence to the U.S. economic policy and also the predictability and also stability of the market. So I think that's not in the U.S. interest. My hunch is that's not something only happening in China. I think because the Trump administration's policy is actually to the rest of the world. So many countries has been influenced. So I think everybody will think twice before invest in the United States.
Well, they might think twice and then realize that there's no alternative. But it's different if we're talking about Europe or Canada or Mexico. Obviously, Chinese investment is seen with great suspicion within the US. And if, as an attempt to rebalance trade, China were to offer large-scale investment, then the United States would probably require special controls along the lines of what China required of Western companies who were doing business in China in years past. So maybe some kind of technology transfer, some special controls in sensitive areas. Is that something that we could see, or you think that's unrealistic on one or both sides at this point?
I think that's possible. I mean, I agree that Chinese company has been viewed with more suspicion in the United States, and even some kind of agreement on investment happened in the future. I think there could be some kind of precondition for that investment. So that's possible, but then it's a business decision for the companies to make. if they will go or not. If I don't invest in the United States, I will lose a very good market. That's true. But I also don't want to lose my operation in the United States after several years investment, right? So that's also something bad for my company. 1 month ago, if you ask me the view on the investment issue, I would be more kind of optimistic. I will say that's something, a promising area in our bilateral economic ties. But today, I will say, very cautious. I think even if the two governments can reach a deal, I don't think the amount of the investment will be great. And I think the Chinese company become much more cautious.
What about a revaluation of currencies or a stimulation of domestic Chinese demand?
I think the RMB is actually is stick to the US dollar. So US dollar is devalued now. So RMB actually follows the US dollar is devaluing. I don't think this is something we want to, but because the currency regime that we follows US dollar. So some people also in China are discussing the possibility to maybe change that regime, maybe kind of follow a basket of the currency rather than US dollar to increase the share of the other currencies. But those are options under discussion in China. And domestic consumption, that's the most important issue, I will say. Probably Trump administration is forcing China to do something right. I mean, if you cannot expand the US market, you have to increase your own domestic consumption. Also, what is happening in trade with the US could maybe slow China's GDP this year to, let's say, 1.5%. So if you want to keep your economy grow as last year, and last year was not very good, but at least you need to keep that level. And if you want to achieve that, you have to increase your domestic consumption. You have no other choice.
That's a good thing anyway, just on its own terms.
Of course, I think that's a good thing. If you ask the economist in China, I don't think you can meet any serious economist in China say increasing domestic consumption is a bad thing. I think everyone agree increasing domestic consumption is a good thing. And they all agree that it's too low. I mean, the share of the consumption is too low. The problem is how to achieve the goal to increase consumption. And it needs something quite fundamental changes in China's economic policy and also social security policy and other things like state-owned enterprises reform. It's not easy, but I think what Trump administration is doing probably will force Chinese government to do the right thing. If so, I will say it's good. It's good, though it's painful in the short term. But in the long run, if China's market can become equivalent to the US market, that will be extremely important for China's long-term economic development and also China's influence in the world. If the whole world, I mean the rest of the world, believe Chinese market is something they need to enter, they need to rely, then China will become more influential, actually. We are biggest trading partner with more than 120 countries, but among those 120 countries, we export a lot of products to those countries. So if China one day can become the largest market for more than 100 countries in the world, I think China will be much more influential for our foreign policy. That's very good. So it's
this seems like this would require not just a restructuring of the Chinese economy, but also a fundamental change in the party's priorities, because this imbalance isn't just a product of natural forces or the trajectory of development, but of a choice, right? A political choice to focus on industrial output and export. And the political choice also to raise social benefits. That could have been done at any time. It's obviously complicated to carry out, but it's not as if it was structurally impossible.
I don't think the government or the party have to rely on exportation. Why should they? I mean, so long as you can maintain the economic development, so long as you can improving the living standard, I mean, the government and the party will be welcomed, I mean, domestically. This is not the only option. They can change, but
But so why haven't they changed? Because they clearly have chosen an export-driven policy at the expense of domestic consumption. And now you're saying that the U.S. may force the government to enact changes that are actually beneficial. But why weren't those changes enacted voluntarily?
I think for several reasons. First, of course, we discussed this is not an easy reform, right? You have been already on that track for many years. I mean, after China entered WTO, China's economy has been based on, I mean, the exportation has always become a major engine for Chinese economy. So you rely on that path. This is one thing. Secondly, I think the Chinese government want to make China not only a rich country, but a powerful country, a strong country. So then you need technology, you need manufacturing, you need to make breakthrough in, let's say, industrial area, right? You can produce 5Gs, you can make ships, you can make airplanes. I think these are, China does not want to be rich but weak country. So this is a kind of balance. If you want to make your country more powerful and in the short term, I mean, in 10 years, in 20 years, have some kind of industrial policy encouraging those important sector of the economy grow faster. I think, of course, this is the choice. And the last thing I will say was because the so-called strategic competition or the pressure from the United States. So if you cannot produce chips, and then the US say, I have a restriction over this advanced chip, then you have to invest your money in, right? Then the US say, I want an AI competition with China. This is something most important industry in the future. And we have a competition and I have a ban on Chinese company to access any resources. Then China have to invest in that kind of industry. So this external pressure also stimulates Chinese government to invest more in those areas. But I mean, that's not for exportation. That's for a kind of strategic competition. You can say just like during the Cold War, when the US started, the Reagan administration started the Star War, the missile defense system, then the Soviet side being dragged into kind of competition. And that already happened to some extent in China. Like in Tsinghua, once I talked to the EMBA program, so all those members of the program are kind of the leaders of the companies, startups. One of the member was a senior, I think he's a CEO from a bubble tea company. And many of them are from like AI or semiconductor, this kind of thing. So we have the discussion in the classroom, is bubble tea company important or not? Bubble tea is not cheap, it's not AI. But I think bubble tea is important because they can create jobs, they pay tax, and also it makes people happy, right? So I think that's extremely important. But when the government only have limited resources and you are facing very severe competition from the US and maybe Western world, and you only have $1, will you invest in bubble tea or invest in AI? I think the answer is quite obvious. So for all those reasons, I think China has been kind of trapped into that old development model. So now the Trump administration may force China to jump to the other track because you have no choice, right? You have no choice. So it's kind of shock therapy, not only to the US, but also to China maybe, but it will be very painful. Actually, to be honest, to rebalance US-China economic, I won't oppose rebalancing China-US economic ties. I think that could be good for both sides, but the approach that the Trump administration has adopted is something I feel very worrisome. I mean, unilaterally announcing high tariff, and then if you go to talk to the Trump administration, President Trump said, they are kissing my ass. So how can you expect Chinese government to do that? So the goal could be reasonable, I think, but the approach is, for me at least, problematic.
But you were just saying earlier that it doesn't matter who initiates trade talks. So obviously, a country of the status of China cannot be seen to be kissing ass in any circumstance. But nonetheless, if there is a sense that rebalancing is best for both countries and in China's own national interest, and if a certain discount is made for Trump's well-known style, then you can ignore the circus somewhat and seek the Chinese classical win-win.
Yes, I agree. So again, I think this morning in that announcement, obviously the two sides, again, no matter who made the first move, but the two sides has already working toward that direction. So that shows no matter who kiss whose ass, but both sides show the flexibility. I think that's not bad, right?
I think to kiss each other's ass at the same time, you'd have to be very flexible. So I think we've got, yeah, so long as we have acrobats on each side, we'll all end up happier. Do you think there's a way? So it's hard enough to rebalance the economic trade, even if that were best for both parties, just because of the level of asymmetry. As you said, it's not just a matter of China buying up a bunch of American goods. You could never rebalance trade that way. There'd have to be a total adjustment to the Chinese economy, which can't be done overnight. Is there a way for trade talks to be combined with the Taiwan issue, that the U.S. would make some adjustments on Taiwan that China would appreciate, some new communique, a reassertion of the one China policy, a statement about not opposing future peaceful reunification, maybe pulling back some military trainers, and in return get something immediate on the economic front that Trump could declare domestically to be a big triumph? Or are these two issues separate in the eyes of Beijing and should not be combined?
I will say I will be very, very surprised if we can move any progress in that regard. I mean, to link the two issues together. I think it's very unlikely for many reasons. One of the reasons I think Taiwan is not something you can buy. And also Taiwan have their own agency. So yeah, maybe one day Trump administration may say, yeah, let's sign a communique. I think basically it's unlikely, it's impossible. But let's imagine if one day they say, let's sign a communique, new communique. Then you give me some compromise in economic side. I think first the US can change the communique very soon. So after this administration, it's something with the executive branch. So this executive branch can do it, but next administration could change it. So it's not very trustworthy. And also, even if we do that, does that really mean we can make a major progress to reunify China with Taiwan? I doubt. I mean, there are 23 million people living in the island. So winning the hearts and minds are the most important thing rather than, of course, if we can reach agreement with the US, that's good from our perspective, but that's far from enough. Generally speaking, I don't think that geopolitical issues is something negotiable, both for China and the United States. It's too difficult. So link to economic talk to Taiwan, I think it's too complicated. And I think it's from the view of the US domestic politics, I also think this is impossible. So
just because you think that the U.S. wouldn't be able to make any conciliatory gestures regarding Taiwan at this stage in the relationship?
There are so many people had a very hardline position on that issue in the United States. So again, President Trump could do something announcement and maybe create an opening, for new debate discussion in the United States. But I don't think about the Congress, think about the overall strategic community. I think that's something will be there for a very long time. President Trump will be there for 4 years, but those people will be there for a very long time.
Makes sense. Although that makes the picture on Taiwan fairly bleak if China is convinced that the U.S. is just going to increase support for the island no matter what. But as far as you're concerned, the policy is still to win hearts and minds, not to storm the channel and surround the island.
No matter which approach to reunify the island, the ultimate goal is to win the hearts and minds of the people right there. So no matter you use a peaceful way, you win the hearts and minds, then you reunify the island. That's, of course, I will say, the ideal sequence. But it's also possible that one day you have to use military force, and then after that you gradually win hearts and minds. But that will be more difficult. But you still need to win. So that's something for me, of course, always the most important goal is to win the hearts and minds. But I'm not sure. I don't want to equal that to peaceful reunification. I hope it's the same, but it not necessarily to be the same thing. Yeah.
Well, the Russians hoped to win hearts and minds with the help of a few tanks and seem to have miscalculated. But now they've gone about as far as they may get. We'll see what they'll do over the next few months. But there seems to be the potential of a meeting of the minds between Putin and Trump. Does that unsettle China at all to see Russia and the US potentially normalizing relations?
Of course, that's an issue a lot of people discuss here, like reverse the Kissinger effect. I personally don't worry about that at all. I think there is a zero chance of reverse the Kissinger effect for several reasons. First, I think first and foremost, I think if we go back to history, it's not Kissinger or Nixon split China and the Soviet Union. And actually, China and the Soviet Union split first from the late 1950s through the whole 1960s. And we had two border conflict with the Soviet Union in 1969. Actually, the sound of the gun in Amur River actually sent a signal to the U.S. decision maker that there is a chance that the U.S. can maybe try to normalize its relations with China. So in today's situation, China-Russia relations are still very solid. I think the two economies are kind of very much integrated, and the relations between the two governments has been quite robust. And in the process that the US and the Trump administration talk to each other, I think we are basically be briefed by the Russian side. They think about that very well. And also, I think President Xi is going to visit Russia soon this year.
He's going for May 9th for Victory Day, right?
Yeah, I think so. So anyway, the senior tie is still very strong. And I don't think Russians are so naive, say, okay, now Trump administration improving our relations, let's abandon China. I think Russians are very sophisticated in terms of their strategic approach. I think they are very good geopolitical player. I think they will improve their relations with the US, but at the same time maintain their strong tie with China. And also, I don't think in the US, it's a little bit like our discussion earlier about Taiwan issue. I think there is a strong mistrust towards Russia in the United States. So I think that kind of mistrust will be there for quite a long time. So if we look back to history of the Russian Revolution, so it's already more than 100 years past. How many years of the good, healthy relationship between the two countries we have? Maybe only after the collapse of Soviet Union and some years of Boris Yeltsin, and maybe sometime earlier time of Putin movement after September 11. I mean,
well, and
altogether
also
maybe
a
10
few
years
years
of good time.
during World War II when they were fighting on the same side. That shouldn't be forgotten. And then when they founded the United Nations together.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So altogether, let's say maybe 15 years of good time, then maybe 90 years of bad time. So it's very deeply rooted, difficulties between the two countries. So again, I think there is a ceiling of the improvement of the US-Russia relationship. And I think there is also a strong tie between China and Russia. And I even want to go further. I want to say Russia is a big country. I think Russia should not be forced into a corner diplomatically. And it's hardly to imagine Russia only have good relations with China or rely on its relation with China. I think of course, Russia will want to change that situation. And I think a too close China-Russia relationship, and at the same time, a very hostile Russia-US relationship is not in China's interest, to be honest. I hope Russia, US, China, and maybe Europe and maybe India all can be independent player on the world stage. No country have to rely on the other one. So our policies on a certain set of the issues could overlap, but our policy on the other issues could be different, even conflicting. I think this is a multipolar world. I think an improvement of Russia-US relationship will give Russia bigger space and make them feel more comfortable, and then will make China feel more comfortable, I will say. If the old trajectory continue, then I think the trend is that we'll see two blocks in the world, one leading by the US, then with Europe, with other Western countries, then the other led by China, and Russia may be in that block. And so that's not in China's interest. I don't think that's in China's interest. I don't want to see the two blocks politics in the world, and within that two blocks, China and the US become kind of, US is the tit, China is the tat. Then we have the tit for tat reaction and overreaction between China and the US. I think it's bad for China, bad for the US, bad for Russia. So I think improving US-Russia relationship, to some extent at least, I think it's good for everyone.
So the US clearly wants Russia to be more autonomous, less dependent on China, because it fears that a Russia dependent on China will strengthen China in the competition with the US. But you're saying from China's perspective, a more independent Russia is also perhaps preferable, because if Russia is tied too tightly to China and is too dependent on China, then it may get uncomfortable and anxious and start causing problems in this position.
First, I have to say this is my personal view. This is not China's perspective. I cannot represent. And also, I don't think I'm a mainstream. Probably I'm minority on that issue. But back to your argument, this is what I mean. I mean, if China-Russia become very close, and then at the same time, US-Russia are kind of hostile, then the US pressure on Russia will be also put on China. Secondly, I don't think Russia can really help China greatly if our relations with the US is really bad. Let's imagine if we have a military conflict, or we have a long-term Cold War style competition with the US. What benefit can Russia bring to China? Maybe some. Yeah, they can supply stable energy to China, and they may support China diplomatically. But what else? I don't think Russia is an asset. Of course, Russia is a partner, is a good neighbor. But I don't think China should view Russia as an asset to compete with the US. And I also don't want Russia to be kind of liability of China. I think Russia is a big power, and they will sooner or later they will gain that room. I think Russia diplomacy has been very, very active and try to create bigger space. When I say I hope the Russia need to play and will play independent role, the basic reason is actually I think I respect Russia as an important country in the world, on the world stage. So I hope China and Russia can be good neighbors to each other, and we have strong, robust relationship, economic, diplomatic, strategic. That's good. But I also hope that Russia be an independent player, and I'm quite sure they will have. I'm not sure if now, but sooner or later they will have.
Well, so you just described a multipolar world where instead of blocks, there is a balance among the large countries, Russia, China, India, the US, maybe some others. How is that different from what Trump is aiming to create? Because there's clearly a turn away from the liberal order that Biden and many of his predecessors, maybe all the way back to 1950, promoted. So there is a new framework for US foreign policy. To what extent do you think it ultimately aligns with what China prefers? Obviously, there are going to be all sorts of difficulties in arriving, if we ever do, at this new world order, because there's plenty of inertia. The US bloc is built a certain way. Conflict is already brewing between the US and China, and active between the US and Russia. But nonetheless, do you think there is a way for these Chinese vision of the world and the sort of more Trumpian or sort of post-liberal vision of America to align?
Ironically, I think the worldview of the Trump administration is, I would say, quite similar to China's, particularly around this concept of multipolar world. I think the Trump administration also used that term. Of course, we could mean different thing with the same concept, but we all believe that first, this is a basic reality that there are several important players on world stage. So not only the US, not all China, Russia, Europe, India. So we could see more. I mean, this is a reflection of the reality. So it's not a one country or two country dominate world. Secondly, I think the Trump administration has, I don't know if they intentionally doing that or unintentionally, but what they have done showed the fundamental change. This fundamental change is related to value, to norm. So you mentioned the liberal international order. In the past, I will say, let's say the Western world believed that they share the same value, same liberal value, and US, Europe, and also the Western country believed that they are on the right side of the history. And China, Russia, maybe some others are on the wrong side of history. And probably many developing country or the third parties, I don't know I mean, it's a very complicated picture, but maybe some of them may also believe that the West is on the right side of history. So, but anyway, there are two sides of the history, wrong side of history and the right side of history. So it's kind of black and white, correct and wrong. But now, I mean, situation has become more complicated. I think it's very funny when I saw the voting in UN General Assembly on the resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This time, I think US, Russia, and North Korea, Israel, among others, I think about less than 20 countries, I guess, vote against that resolution. And China abstained. Many other countries supported that. So you can see the change of the camps. And also it's a change of the...
And the United States is leaving the camp that it had created.
Yeah.
That this latest vote in the UN Assembly, the US already did not vote to condemn Russia, whereas before it had been attempting to mobilize as much of the world as possible.
Exactly. So, I mean, and then Vice President J.D. Vance went to Munich telling Europeans that you have different value from us. So all these changes are very fundamental. So I don't know. I think it's very much depend on the U.S. domestic politics. So I don't think I should draw conclusion too early. But I mean, I don't know what will happen 4 years later. But I think it's at least the Trump administration's thoughts are reflecting at least 50% Americans' view on all those issues. So that means on that issue, on the norm issue, on the value issue, there are different values now, even among the Western countries. So that's a real multipolar world, right? Multipolarity should not only refer to the distribution of power. Distribution of power is one side of the multipolarity. The other is our view are different. As I said earlier, they may agree with each other on a set of issue, and they may disagree with each other on the other side of the issue. I mean, so it's a very complicated situation. So I think we are moving towards that multipolar, though I don't like the term, but we are moving towards a multiplayer world. It's still different from the 19th century European politics. I think it's still different, but we are moving towards that direction. I think it could mean more conflicts, even wars. It would be a more dangerous world. When China has advocated for multipolar world for many years, but I don't think China really wants a war or want a chaotic world. When we call for a multipolar world, when we, from 90s, we advocate for multipolarity. It's just show our dissatisfaction with the unipolarity. So can we really handle the dark side of the multipolar world? I mean, this is the task that we are facing. China, US, and others are facing. No matter multipolar world is a good thing or bad thing, you like it or not, we are facing it. So we have to manage it. It could be very dangerous.
But could China become powerful enough that it would provide the single world ordering pole? Is that part of China's ambitions?
I don't think so. First, I don't think when you say China, whether China is powerful, I mean, the most important power is intellectual, I will say, is intellectual power. Can you envision international order, which is good for most of the people in the world and also something practical that you can implement, you can build. And it should be better than the past world. It should be fair world. It should be a justified international order. I don't think we have that idea so far. Also, of course, I don't think China's material power is and will be big enough. I don't think so. The US is still the most powerful country in foreseeable future. And I think other countries are also emerging, and Europe is still important. I don't think China have that dominant power, material power to do that. And I don't think China have the intellectual power to make China ready for that. So I think if so, China should first learn from other countries, be humble, and also talk to each other. I think the government need to talk to each other, and the intellectuals need to talk to each other together.
I think you said that China didn't have the power to dominate the world and didn't necessarily have the conceptual wherewithal to devise a perfect or preferable world order, which I think is a message that will be very reassuring to a Washington audience. But one final question. You mentioned Vance going to Europe and telling his audience that perhaps the US and Europe were functioning now according to different values. So if you had to predict in the next 4 years, will the transatlantic relationship rupture, or will the Western Bloc continue to cohere?
I think the transatlantic relationship will be quite difficult in upcoming 4 years for what the Trump administration has done and has said. I think it's already make the European countries very, very uncomfortable, and I will say panic. And I think Trump administration will continue that direction. I think they talk in that way seriously. This is what they are thinking. But the question is not if they will have problem. The question is how far can two sides go and how bad could the relationship be in next 4 years? And then what if after 4 years the Democrats or another president change the trajectory? Will the transatlantic relationship recover as back to normal? I think those are the two questions I'm asking. I'm listening to my colleagues in US and in Europe. I think there will be a limit in this friction between the US and the Europe, because Europe, of course, they are very, very unhappy. They are very angry. I think they are angrier than, let's say, 20 years ago when the US launched the Iraq War. They have dispute between this old Europe and the US. And I think there are, of course, friction in the first Trump administration. But this time, I think it's even deeper, bigger. And the EU has already decided to build up their own capability. But I think first and foremost, again, it's an intellectual, conceptual issue. I think Europe has talked about strategic autonomy for a very long time. But to be honest, with due respect to my European colleagues, I think the European side still have a long way to be intellectually autonomous, I will say. Now it's Trump administration showing that autonomy from the old concept, old thoughts in Western liberal world. I don't think European countries are ready to that, so they are still stick to the old days. And then in the material side, I will say if they want their own defense, military security power, it's a long way to go. They need to build their industry, they need to build their troops. They may need to fight a war even one day. Are the Europeans ready to do that? I doubt. And obviously, no need to mention EU is a so complicated entity. I think our expectation to their collective action will be limited. But again, this is something more serious than 20 years ago or 8 years ago. I think we will see more frictions across the Atlantic, but I don't think it will become, at least in the next 4 years, I don't think it will become a completely kind of, I don't know if decoupling is a good word, but I mean, at least intellectually decoupling. I don't think that will happen in next 4 years. But if this trend continue, because I also asked the question, what about 4 years later? If 4 years later this trajectory continues, then we may see more and more profound differences between Europe and the US. But I'm not so sure for the second question.
Yeah, of course they're mad because Trump is embarking on a fundamental revision of the transatlantic relationship. But I, like you, am quite skeptical of any possibility of a united EU outside of the American umbrella. The EU as an institution is entirely too complex and unwieldy.
Yeah.
The bigger countries are of too similar a size to rearm together. France obviously wants to produce all the weapons for entirety of the EU, but would Germany and Poland and Britain accept that? I mean, Britain's not in the EU, but in NATO. I doubt it. So we'll see. I think either they remain united under the US umbrella or the whole thing fractures into the old divided continent that it was for so long. But whatever. We will wish ill on no one, hope for win-win-win across the board.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for joining me a second time.
Thank you, Peter, for having me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.